In 1944, while the world was engulfed in the horrors of World War II, an extraordinary event took place in Britain. Helen Duncan, a spiritualist medium, was arrested and tried for witchcraft, a crime that seemed to belong to the Middle Ages. Accused under the Witchcraft Act of 1735, an obsolete law that criminalized the practice of magical arts, Helen became known as the last person convicted of witchcraft in the country, in a case that blends war secrets, fear of the unknown, and a legal system in conflict with itself. But what made a mother of 6, who held seances for grieving families, be seen as a national threat? Helen gained notoriety for her alleged ability to materialize spirits, including soldiers killed in combat. In one of these seances, held in Portsmouth, she allegedly revealed classified details about the sinking of HMS Barham, a British warship whose destruction had been kept secret by the government. The information, which could only have been known by military authorities, raised suspicions of espionage, or, for some, of genuine supernatural powers. Helen Duncan's case is not just about witchcraft. It reflects an era when the fear of the invisible clashed with wartime paranoia. As the Nazis advanced across Europe, the British government saw her seances as a risk. Could mediums like her expose strategic secrets, such as the D-Day plans, through communication with the dead? The response was a police operation that raided one of her seances, confiscated evidence of fraud, and arrested her on charges that echoed the 17th century witch trials. This is a historical enigma that defies logic. How was an 18th century law used to convict a woman at the height of modernity? Was Helen a skillful fraud or a victim of collective hysteria? Her story exposes the tensions between reason and superstition, between national security and individual freedom, and serves as a warning about how the past can resurface in the most critical moments. To understand the trial of Helen Duncan, it is necessary to go back to 1735, when the British Parliament replaced the Witchcraft Act of 1604, which sentenced witches to death, with a new law. The 18th century version, curiously, did not criminalize witchcraft itself, but rather pretending to exercise supernatural powers. The state, influenced by the Enlightenment, no longer believed in magic but sought to punish charlatans who deceived the public. This change reflected a paradox. The same society that ridiculed witchcraft still spent resources persecuting those who claimed to practice it. Between 1735 and 1944, there were about 200 witchcraft trials in the United Kingdom. Most involved women accused of divination, spiritual healing, or contact with the dead. A notable case was that of Jane Rebecca York, convicted in 1944, the same year as Helen, for fortune-telling with a crystal ball. The law served less to protect morality and more to control marginal practices, especially in times of social crisis. But why did such an archaic law survive into the 20th century? The answer lies in the fear of the unknown. During World War I, spiritualism gained momentum as millions of families sought contact with fallen soldiers. Mediums, once seen as curiosities, became public figures, and, to the government, potential threats. In a 1941 report, MI5 warned that seances could be used to leak military secrets or spread misinformation. The Witchcraft Act of 1735, though obsolete, was a convenient tool to silence these oracles. The law also reflected a cultural conflict. As science advanced, practices like spiritualism challenged the authority of the church and the state. Persecuting mediums was a way to reaffirm control over public narratives. Unsurprisingly, many trials occurred during wars or social upheavals when the government sought to demonstrate strength. Helen Duncan became entangled in this web in 1944. Her case was not a historical accident, but the culmination of centuries of ambiguous legislation. The same law that protected the public from fraud became an instrument to censor the undesirable. Proof that, even in modern times, the ghost of medieval witch hunts still haunted British justice. Helen Duncan was born on March 25, 1897, in Callander, a small Scottish town. The daughter of a carpenter and a laundress, she grew up in poverty and married young to Henry Duncan, a soldier who had returned from World War I. Together, they had 6 children, and it was in the 1920s, seeking to support her family, that Helen began conducting seances, a practice that had gained popularity after the war, with thousands of families desperate for contact with deceased loved ones. Her fame arose from her spirit materializations, a phenomenon in which supposed entities appeared as figures shrouded in mist or ectoplasm, a white substance that emerged from her mouth. Witnesses described silhouettes speaking in distinct voices, identifying themselves as fallen soldiers or distant relatives. In one session in 1933, for example, Helen allegedly materialized the spirit of a girl named Peggy, whose family confirmed details she could not have known. However, her methods sparked suspicion. In 1931, the renowned fraud investigator Harry Price examined Helen and claimed that the ectoplasm was made of gauze, toilet paper, and egg whites. Photographs from the time show Helen with fabric emerging from her mouth, and in a session in London, one of Price's assistants interrupted her trance and grabbed the ectoplasm, revealing it to be a piece of muslin. Despite these accusations, followers swore by her authenticity, including a doctor who claimed to have seen human organs within the material. The peak of her career coincided with World War II. In 1941, during a session in Edinburgh, Helen channeled the spirit of a sailor who claimed to have died aboard the HMS Barham, a British ship sunk by the Germans months earlier, a detail the government had kept secret to prevent public demoralization. The revelation alarmed authorities. How could a woman with no military connections know this? For some, it was proof of supernatural powers. For others, it suggested espionage or leaked information. Helen lived at the heart of a paradox. To her clients, she was a savior, offering comfort in dark times. To skeptics, she was a fraud who exploited others' grief. Her own husband, Henry, described her as an ordinary woman who never spoke about how she did it, but used the money from seances to feed their children. This ambiguity made her both a beloved and hated figure, and, in 1944, a perfect target for the state. On January 19, 1944, in Portsmouth, a strategic port city during World War II, Helen Duncan held the séance that would seal her fate. About 30 people were present, including relatives of soldiers, curious onlookers, and, without her knowledge, undercover Secret Service agents. The atmosphere was tense. Portsmouth housed critical naval bases, and any information leak could compromise military operations. During the trance, Helen claimed to channel the spirit of a sailor who identified himself as belonging to the HMS Barham, a warship sunk by a German submarine in 1941. Specific details were revealed: the number of casualties, over 800 crew members, the explosion of the ammunition depot, and even the names of officers. The problem? The loss of the Barham was a state secret. The government had withheld the information to avoid panic and demoralization among the troops. Minutes after the supposed spirit materialized, the police raided the venue. Officers searched Helen and found pieces of white gauze and a viscous liquid, supposed ectoplasm, hidden in her clothing. Witnesses reported that the agents tore off the veil covering the spirit, exposing a figure made of fabric and cardboard. Helen was arrested under the charge of violating the Witchcraft Act, but the real motivations ran deeper. The government feared that her séances were a smokescreen for leaking classified information, whether intentionally or not. The incident raised troubling questions. How could a woman with no access to military intelligence know details of the shipwreck? There were suspicions that she might have had human sources, such as sailors' wives, or that, in an act of recklessness, the British government used her case to send a message, cracking down on anyone who challenged state control over information. Helen's arrest was anything but discreet. Sensationalist newspapers dubbed her the Witch of Portsmouth, and cartoons depicted her as a grotesque figure manipulating ghostly puppets. To the public, the case was both fascinating and absurd. In the 20th century, a woman was being hunted for witchcraft, while airplanes bombed Europe. This event marked the beginning of a trial that would intertwine the paranormal, politics, and the remnants of a medieval law in a modern courtroom. Helen Duncan, unknowingly, had become the fragile link between the dark past of witch hunts and the technological present of total war. Helen Duncan's trial began on March 1, 1944, at the Old Bailey Court in London, the same venue where Nazi war criminals would later stand trial. The prosecution, led by L.A. Byrne, was built on two pillars: spiritual fraud and national security risk. Byrne argued that Helen not only deceived vulnerable people but also endangered the war effort by disclosing secret information. The defense, led by Charles Lousby, a conservative MP, countered, "She is a woman of faith, not a spy." The case drew international attention. The prosecution presented evidence of gauze ectoplasm and photographs from the séances, claiming it was nothing more than cheap theatrics. Defense witnesses, including Helen's followers, swore they had received accurate messages from deceased relatives. A soldier testified that she revealed details of his brother's death in France that only he could have known. However, the turning point came when illusionist John Booth demonstrated to the jury how the materializations could be easily recreated using cloth and light tricks. Judge Sir Gerald Dodson was blatantly biased. In a now iconic moment, he asked Helen, "If you can speak to the dead, why don't you tell us where Hitler is?" A remark that would go viral in newspapers. In his final defense plea, Loosby pointed out the absurdity of the situation. This is 1944, not 1692. Convicting someone of witchcraft is a return to medieval ignorance. After 7 days, the jury found Helen guilty by 11 votes to 1. The sentence, 9 months in Holloway Prison, a facility known for housing Nazi spies. The conviction sparked outrage. Winston Churchill, then Prime Minister, wrote to the Home Secretary, "This case is an absurdity. Jailing a woman for witchcraft in the middle of a war is a waste of resources." However, this letter would only be revealed decades later. The trial exposed the hypocrisy of the system. While Helen rotted in prison, the British government was secretly using mediums for Nazi disinformation operations, such as the infamous case of the MI5 medium, who tricked German intelligence with false predictions. The message to the public was clear. The state could exploit the occult, but ordinary citizens could not. Helen was released from prison in 1945, physically and emotionally shattered. But her case left one lingering question. How many more witches would be symbolically burned under laws that no one dared to challenge? Helen Duncan's case was not just about witchcraft or fraud. It was a power play. One of the most accepted theories is that her trial was meant to silence war leaks. In 1944, the Allies were preparing for the Normandy invasion, D-Day, and any leaked detail could compromise the operation. Helen, by revealing secrets like the sinking of HMS Barham, became a liability. Declassified MI5 documents show that intelligence services monitored mediums, fearing that seances could be used to transmit codes or information disguised as messages from the dead. Another theory points to a crackdown on spiritualism. In the 1940s, the spiritualist movement had over 300,000 followers in the UK, challenging the Anglican Church's dominance. Mediums like Helen were seen as threats to moral order, and her trial may have been a way to suppress alternative practices. Not coincidentally, in 1944, other psychics were prosecuted, such as Jane Rebecca York, who was convicted for using a crystal ball. There is also the class and gender prejudice hypothesis. Helen was a poor, uneducated woman who defied male-dominated authorities with her revelations. Her trial reflected the stigma against women who occupied public spaces outside the traditional roles of mother and wife. Prosecutor L.A. Byrne even described her as a manipulator of weak minds, using misogynistic language. But the most disturbing theory involves psychological warfare experiments. Reports suggest the British government was investigating the use of mediums for disinformation, such as sending false messages to Nazi spies. However, Helen operated outside their control, making her unpredictable. Her case may have been a show of force. Anyone who leaks secrets, even unintentionally, will be punished. The ambiguity remains. To some historians, Helen was an unwitting tool in a larger game. To others, she was a victim of mass hysteria. What we do know is that her trial was no accident. It was a reflection of how governments in crisis use outdated laws to reassert control, even if it means reviving the ghosts of the Inquisition. Helen Duncan's trial was the catalyst for one of the most significant legal reforms of the 20th century in the UK. In 1951, 7 years after her conviction, Parliament repealed the Witchcraft Act of 1735 and replaced it with the Fraudulent Mediums Act, a law that, for the first time, distinguished belief from crime. Instead of persecuting witches, the focus shifted to punishing those who profited by deceiving people with false promises of supernatural powers. The irony? Helen died in 1956, never witnessing the reform her case helped inspire. The repeal was not an act of progressivism, but an admission of shame. Helen's case exposed the absurdity of using 18th century laws in a modern world. Winston Churchill privately criticized the trial as a grotesque waste of time in the middle of a war, subtly pushing for legal changes. The press also played a role. Newspapers like The Guardian questioned why the state was hunting witches while rebuilding war-torn Europe. The new law reflected pragmatic skepticism. The Fraudulent Mediums Act didn't criminalize belief in the supernatural, only the financial exploitation of lies. If a medium acted in good faith, Even if their methods were illusions, they were not criminals. This distinction officially ended the witch hunts in the West, burying over 300 years of legal persecution. The symbolic impact was profound. While countries like Switzerland executed their last witch in 1782, Britain finally admitted that laws based on superstition had no place in a modern society. Helen Duncan, unintentionally, became the face of this transition. Her case is still cited in debates about historical justice, with petitions calling for her posthumous pardon, all rejected under the claim that there are no legal mechanisms to overturn convictions under defunct laws. Today, the UK has museums commemorating the victims of witch hunts, but Helen's legacy is unique. She wasn't burned at the stake, but was symbolically and legally burned by a system that no longer knew how to deal with its own ghosts. Her story serves as a reminder that even in ages of reason, fear of the unknown can resurface, and that when justice is guided by panic, it has the power to revive the darkest chapters of history.